is an interesting one to discuss, because by its very nature, this is a bit of a interpretive game, and what you pull out of it is going to be entirely dependent upon you. We've actually talked about this recently when we went through Gone Home, as we were playing through that one, so I'll be curious to see if the comments section is as interesting as that one has been, but regardless, let's talk about the gameplay first. Is there gameplay? Yes, it was actually a platformer. I was right! Holy crap. It's amazing. By the way, if you're watching this hazardous, sorry, I decided not to do the troll thing. I thought about doing a thing where I would spend the first 5 seconds of the video saying, this game is clearly interpretive, and therefore my interpretation is that it's very anti-woman. And then to wait for about 10 seconds, and then to actually do the rest of the video. And see how many comments I got from people who only watched the first, 10 seconds of the video, because that's actually more common than you'd think. No, really, I have numbers to prove it. But anyways, I decided not to do that. Let's just get on to the gameplay, such as it is. So this is a platformer. The controls are actually pretty tight. I will give it credit there. The controls in this game actually feel better than in, say, for example, Nefarious, where the controls were not super great, as I elucidated upon earlier, or the aforementioned Tiny and Big, where the controls were actually terrible. So, okay, good controls. I'm with it. Very floaty. Took some getting used to. I do like how it expands as we go. We get the jump, then we get the double jump, or actually, then we get the smash, then we get the double jump, and then we get the singing ability and blah, blah, blah. Stuff it unlocks as we go. That's all very cool. The gameplay is very serviceable. And that's kind of the problem. It's not exactly bad gameplay. The only real complaint I had was periodically the game would effectively make the game worse in order to showcase exactly what it wanted me to see. A very common problem I had was the camera would zoom and zoom and zoom and zoom until I could see this beautiful art piece, and it's very pretty. But I have to do platforming on this screen. And occasionally I would have trouble where I'd be like, nope, because I couldn't quite judge the distance because of that and so forth. It wasn't a huge issue. I didn't ding the game too much on it, but the camera was not really great. And the problem was the camera wanted you to appreciate the visuals, the narrative side of the game, rather than actually be serviceable for the gameplay side of the game, the platforming. This is a common trend. Another good example of this, and I actually did ding the game for this, is the game is actually really railroaded. Even for a platformer, which tends to be railroad. What I mean by that is there are several puzzles they would have, and there's one solution to that puzzle. Not counting bugs or exploits, just one. What happened twice in a row, which is where this really was codified for me, is I came up with another way to solve the puzzle, and the game immediately, to its credit, made it clear that that wouldn't work. Because there's only one solution to that puzzle. I'm like, okay, fine, so we'll do the intended solution. Then I went to another thing. I was like, okay, well, I'll just do this. And the game once again made it immediately clear that that wasn't going to work. So it's like, okay, well, I guess we'll do the intended solution to the puzzle as soon as we figure that out, and so forth and so on. I do feel like that actually detracted from the experience at several instances, and thus was a negative. The only negative I gave the game, actually. Because this is a weird one to talk about. I mean, there is platforming, there is puzzles, there is a clear level design. The game feels very much like Portal 1 in several ways. Each stage, as you're going through and moving through the game, is clearly about, here's a mechanic, figure out how it works. Okay, here's a new mechanic, figure out how it works. And it kind of introduces all these different mechanics until you get to the final stage, the temple, the upside-down gravity section, where all of a sudden you have to start combining all of your different mechanics all into one in order to figure out how to progress, along with the new mechanic of the reverse gravity section. That's actually a really well-designed stage, and easily the best part of the gameplay from a gameplay axis perspective. Really fun. Some innovative, fun platforming, interesting perspective puzzles, and just all sorts of cool stuff. I love a lot of how the game would make it so that you decide when things happen. A simple example of this, Mario Galaxy does this, for example. You jump, platform switches. Very, very basic concept, but it means all of how hard or easy this is going to be is really on you and how you do the jumps and the platforming and decide when things are going to be. So putting that in the player's hands, good move. And, of course, there were several cool, I don't want to call them boss sequences, because they really aren't bosses. It's more like obstacle sequences, where we have to deal with the Ichor, is a nice sequence section there. But that brings me to my final point about the gameplay. One of the things that was mentioned several times in chat was, did this game need to be a game? That's an interesting question in its own right, and I wanted to talk about that briefly, if I may. Obviously, this is a very narrative-first game. The focus is very, very clearly and strongly on the narrative axis, and that's fine. There's plenty of games like that. But even a game like Gone Home has gameplay. I myself argued very strongly that there is actually gameplay to Gone Home. There is still design that needs to be done there, or at least should be done there with regards to gameplay design and blah, 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 blah. So even for something like that, sure, cool, with it. So is there gameplay here? Absolutely. Should there be gameplay there? Well, yes. And is there okay, so we've covered that. But would this be better as a non-interactive medium? In my opinion, no. And there's two really big reasons on that. The biggest and most important is obvious. I prefer interactive medium. I prefer a game to tell me a story rather than a story to tell me a story. A movie's fine and a show is fine, but I'll take something that I could play 10 times out of 10 if it's telling me the exact same story, even if the gameplay is relatively simple, like it is in this game, or serviceable, I think is actually a better word. Not spectacular, not terrible, just there. But the second reason is because the people who put together this, several people from the Assassin's Creed team, are people who are game designers. They're not movie makers, they're not show makers, they are game designers. Let me talk about that for just a moment. Because I had the weird thought. I don't know how many of you have this feeling. I know people who do. I myself kind of have this problem. How many of you have a thing where you think, this is what I know how to do? Now, I want to do this, but this is what I know how to do. So that's the worst analogy I've ever done, and it's purely visual, and I know some of you don't even watch these, you only listen to these, so I'm going to try to explain that in words as best as I can. Let's say you know how to make video games, but you really want to tell a story. And there you go, you understand the premise in a nutshell. So you make a game to do it, even though the game is entirely focused and primarily trying to tell a story, you're still trying to make a game to do it because that's what you know and that's how you do it. Just making an animated short, I mean, you can do that. Not sure where you would put it or how you'd market it or how you'd get it out there or anything, but it is something that's possible. But maybe that's just not something that's in your wheelhouse. Do you understand the logic there? To use a personal example, not from me, but from someone I used to know, they were really, really good at painting. And they really wanted to do like an animated thing, and they just couldn't figure out how to do it. They wanted to tell this story. So what they did was they got this really big canvas, and they did it was actually upper left to lower right story. They painted the story in one picture, and you could see it progressing and going through. Because that's what they knew how to do. They knew how to paint. So they told their story in their painting. It turned out really good. I wish I could show you pictures of it. But the point being, using what you know in order to do what you'd like to do is certainly a valid and serviceable answer to this. But that's only one answer, and that's only my opinion. I am curious, of course, of yours. But I suppose we should talk about the narrative axis, because that's probably what we're here for. Before I go any further, for those of you who have actually watched this far, what is your interpretation of what's happening in this story? Not what's actually happening. We do have developer interviews and the like, so we know what the intended story is, and not whatever I interpret. I'll come up with that in just a moment. I just want to know, what's your take? What's your interpretation? How do you perceive? So my take on this, I assume you all paused there in that break in order to jump to the comments and tell me how terrible and awful I am. And how I can't understand why you're so anti-women, Lore. Every time I hear that. But my interpretation is not what the actual intent is. So I'll tell you what the actual intended story is. This woman lost her mother, and she is recovering from that event. This game is a representation of her dealing with the grief she feels at the loss of her mother. Bam, there you go. That's the intended story. Would you believe that's not what I took from it at all? There is one little tidbit in the entire game that leans towards that. So I wanted to call this out because it's wonderful animation. It's done right at the intro. She's there on the statue's hand, and she's crying, and everything's horrible. And then bad stuff starts to happen, and the statue starts to crumble. What does she do? For less than a second, she rushes up and curls up against the palm of the hand as if seeking it, like you would do to your mother, right? Like just, trying to cling to the person for safety. It's very well done. It's very brief. There's a lot of excellent little animation tidbits like that in the actual cutscenes that happen in this game. But other than that, the way I took the entire rest of the game was that the statue is representative of herself. That her self-image and her self-identity is what crumbled, and dealing with the depression that came as a result of that is what the primary course of the game is. The black beast being said depression visually represented. Now, I talked about this on stream, so I'll mention this briefly here. We talk about depression a lot and how common it is. The problem is depression, if we're really being blunt, not counting chemical depression, that is a separate thing, but being in a depressed state, we've talked about this before. being depressed or suffering from depression or something like that, generally speaking, is more of a symptom than a cause. There are things that cause depression. There are many, many things in many different combinations for many different people. That's variable on top of variable on top of variable that causes depression. And since we tend to treat symptoms rather than causes, here we are. And I wanted to mention that because this game does a very good representation of that, in my opinion. Because we go down and everything's dead and everything's empty, but okay, we figure out how to jump again. Cool. We start to get a little bit more of what we're going on. And as we're going through, we free these little black bat things and they just kind of move forward. I'm not sure what that's up with, but we also see the little things that help us to jump, so we assume we're unlocking more of the level. Cool. As we progress and as we move more through the ruins start to reconstruct themselves. Some of the color starts to come back into the world. We learn how to be a block and to push against that which is preventing us from progressing forwards, in this case represented by the wind. We stubborn our way through it. Now, all this probably sounds very familiar, but again, this is all just my interpretation. And that's what I'm giving you here. This is my answer to my own question. We push our way through it. We manage to get a little bit further, start to figure out a few things, start to figure out a few jumping puzzles, and this bird shows up and just screams at us as loud as it possibly can. And yeah, how many of you have ever heard, literally or metaphorically, that little voice in your head that just tells you how stupid, how could you miss that? How did you make that mistake? How could you possibly have screwed up this thing? I get that every day in my YouTube comments, but I imagine a lot of you understand what it's like to have that voice internally instead, to have something just yelling at you. What's wrong with you? Why would you ever think that someone would want to interact with you, to date you, to be your friend, to be someone, a family member? Why would you think they would ever want anything to do with you? Screaming, yelling, raging. We managed to barely push our way through that. And the screams lose coherence. More and more, it's less of a bird and more of just a giant blob monster, which is still screaming at us, of course, because the specific focus of what that negative detraction is blurs over time until it gets to the point where all you hear is negativity, your mind actually processing it literally as just negativity, the concept, not a word, no vocals, no dialogue, no voice, just you suck, personified. And then we push through that a little bit further. Mention a little section. We bring some stuff back. We go down into the water. That's cool. The water section is probably my favorite area in the game, narratively speaking, because it is appropriately peaceful and terrifying, depending on what it needs to be, just like underwater actually would be. And just like going into the depths of what we feel and how we feel actually would be. And while we're down there, the ink re-represents itself as a massive amorphous eel which is racing after us, desperately trying to swallow us. And of course, it is substantially more terrifying than before, and we are much more desperate to avoid it than before because things have started to get better, and that's exactly how that works, isn't it? We are more vulnerable to the same thing than we would be before because things have gotten better, because we feel better about ourselves, because we're starting to recover and think maybe it's not all that bad. And then something bad, even minor, even relatively insignificant, something just runs across you and you strip and you tremble, you trip and you stumble, and we say it correctly instead of incorrectly. And then things get much worse and you're so much more desperate to avoid it. Fortunately, periodically, some of us actually have someone else to help us, like a turtle, which comes in and saves us at the last moment. Because, we can support each other in these kind of matters. Someone else can be there for us. Someone else can be our safety net or our light, or just gives us just enough oomph in order to not be swallowed whole. And so we make our way up. We have a whole lengthy, awesome level section. I don't have much to say narratively about the final stage. It's the Portal 1 thing. I already mentioned that, right? You spend the first few levels learning the mechanics, and then here's the game, right? That's the same thing. So the game happens, and this is the most game section of the game, and it's also the best game section of the game. But then you get to the end of that, bringing back the light, bringing out the yellow, and it comes back, but this time it takes the form of a woman. Now, in this case, in my interpretation, this is most assuredly just us, just our own face speaking to us, screaming at us, devouring us whole, and we try to sing, in this case, a representation of how we feel and believe about ourselves, our identity, our purpose, our thoughts, our dreams, our hopes, whatever else you want to put it. Positivity, let's just call it what it is. our positivity sings and pushes it black. But negativity is an interesting thing, because negativity actually has no power except what it is given. And so even as she is there being consumed and drowned, the black ichor is just completely covering both her and the statue. And then the statue starts singing with her. Now, again, in the intended story, this is supposed to be her mother. I get it. In my interpretation that I mentioned just a few seconds ago, this is her. Real her, if you will. Who she thinks of as herself. Her identity, having been reformed, is now strong enough to sing positivity in order to push back the ichor, the black beast of depression, the negativity. It sings, they sing together, and having now come to grips with who she is, what she is, and why she is able to arise and get out of that nonsense. This is actually a while ago, several years ago now, some people argued that the review system that I utilize, the pluses and minuses system, should have provisos for things that are not mathematically quantifiable. Allow me to go and give my opinion that everything is mathematically quantifiable if you do it right. And there's absolutely pluses to story for something like feels. I will admit without shame that the ending of this game actually was pulling me to tears. I don't know how many of you saw it, because we're on the 16:9 thing, so my webcam was like this on that screen. But I actually was legitimately crying during that outro. It was very powerful, beautifully presented, both visually and audibly, the watercolor style of approach, and the significantly well-animated, not quite 3D animation of the character, as well as the music and the swelling and the usage of sound to emphasize the difference. A lot of deep, bassy sounds for the ichor. A lot of almost goop sound. It sounds like oil that's just dripping, But whenever you're away from that, there's more lighthearted upper tones, ding, 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 as well as kind of a thing. Massive, wonderful contrast between these to emphasize the two tones that this game works its way through. This is worth playing through, in my opinion, as opposed to the aforementioned Nefarious, which I talked about last Friday, I want to say, which is much more worth watching. I recommend, if you have not, to go ahead and play this game. And if you feel like it, go ahead and tell me your interpretation. I hope you have enjoyed these thoughts. I'll see you next time.